Hi, everyone, and welcome to Stubby Talks Transformation, the podcast where change really looks inside organizations and talking with the business leaders who actually make change happen. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Javier Romero, founder of Oson Limited. Javier is a strategic partner of mine, and I'm really delighted to have him on board, chatting all things organizational design and change, which we'll get onto, I'm sure. Javier, for those that don't know you, can you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about what Oson does?
Yes. So I am Javier Romero. I am the founder and managing director of Oson Limited. We are a pragmatic, human-centric organizational change agency. So in more normal speak, that would be going into any sort of organizations, public sector, private sector, third sector, and looking at either what isn't working and working with people inside of the organization to make improvements, find remedies, etc., all to get results, or also to get results, to look at potential improvements, particularly if they're dealing with, say, changes in markets, expansions, contractions, etc., and always with an eye on the people aspect, the human element of doing business. I've been working in this space in one form or another for nearly 30 years now. I've got a background in social anthropology. I have a degree in that from Harvard University, and really find just great joy in helping my clients, just work through, resolve, and thrive after addressing any challenges that they're facing.
Amazing. I love that. So is that kind of your career path, the social anthropology to organizational design, or has there been movements in between then?
Well, it's been an evolution. If you had asked me, I remember when I switched from economics to social anthropology in my university days, but still told people I want to go into management consulting. Everyone laughed. Nobody thought. I think they had a very different impression as to what social anthropology was. But I remember in my economics education, and all due respect to the way Harvard teaches, or at least used to teach economics, it was very econometric. It was very quantitative, and I was very interested in the human aspect, because ultimately, I mean, I could see, organizations, they succeed or fail based upon how their people are working together, and it's been just, yeah, sort of a real evolution of first going into learning how to work. I mean, I actually started off in technology consulting in all things, but they wanted a business analyst because it was all about the tech, and we really should be thinking about what the business needs are, and that is just over the years and over the decades turned into really looking at and understanding the machination, the mechanics of organizations, and learning, the different levers, the different aspects to running an organization, to find ways basically you know, to resolve any of the challenges that are being faced, whilst never losing sight of the fact that fundamentally, we're a bunch of humans running around with all of our emotions and our irrationality, and getting things done sort of with that view.
Amazing. And you've worked with a lot of blue chip organizations, haven't you, in your time? What patterns have you seen that kind of ultimately led you to founding Oson?
Well, so weirdly, I founded Osan because I saw that so much attention was being paid towards blue chip organizations, large corporate multinationals, but that the SMEs of the world need attention in that experience as well. And recognizing that a lot of the problems, most organizations will say that they are different and unique, with very few exceptions. The problems they face are broadly the same. And there's a lot to be said for being able to sort of, draw on the experience that one has had with, say, similar problems that might have been faced in one sector and bringing them over to another. And with Oson, it's about taking that and saying, well, you know what, you don't have to have, you know, um, I don't know, 50,000 staff to, about 200,000 staff to need consulting, help. If you're a few hundred people, if you're a couple thousand people, the same levers, the same remedies, the same perspectives that can help these large organizations be successful, they can be applied elsewhere. And let's face it, I mean, just SMEs are a significant part of any economy, including very much the UK. So I saw that as very much a need that needed to be addressed.
Yeah. Do you feel that some SMEs feel like they are out of reach for some of those tools, those techniques like organizational design and change? and what I do in the world of customer experience and continuous improvement, do you feel like we're not big enough to be able to utilize those tools and techniques yet, and they kind of feel out of touch?
Wonder if it's not so much about the size of the organization, if we're talking about the number of people, the number of staff. I think often what holds back smaller organizations from getting outside advice is cost. And they look at the way, especially if you've got somebody who's running, you know, uh, uh, a small medium-sized organization, and they've worked in a large corporate, and they saw how these larger consultancies will just have these armies of consultants coming in, each of them charging however many thousands a day, um just absolute massive budgets for this sort of work, and thinking there's no way, that my firm with its, I don't know, 500, 5,000 people, with revenues only in, I don't know, 7, 8 figures, although we could never afford that sort of work. And so the approach that I take, which I think my clients really appreciate, especially the smaller ones, trying to learn how to, oh, sorry, trying to help, an organization's internal resources learn how to design and manage and sustain change for themselves.
Mm.
You don't need the army of people, especially for the small organizations. You don't need the armies of people, of consultants coming in and telling you what to do. It's about being, one person, or in some cases, because I'll, bring yourself in, Dave, or, bring, a couple of other partners, and just like, how can we, in abbreviated time, work with their people to educate and empower them such that we can sort of like, dust our hands off in a few days or a few weeks, or, maybe the bigger problems a few months, but be done. Actually say, look, we've got success, we've got measurable results, we can move on to the next thing, call us up in a couple of years when you're moving on to your next challenge, and you can re-engage us then. And I think that that's a much more, in my mind, ethical and humane way of running consulting.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. And I think what you've said really lends itself to, I think, both of our approaches is we're not coming in to tell you what to do. We're coming in to say, this is the roadmap, the path we should go down, and actually help with the execution and delivery of it. We're not kind of just, I say typical consulting, but we're not stand back consultants that come in and go, that needs to change, that needs to move, do this, do that, and sit back and watch it happen. We roll our sleeves up, we get involved, and we showcase and lead from the front with those behaviors that helps to empower the front line and give them the autonomy to go, oh, we can do this ourselves, can't we?
Yeah, yeah, and we do it with them, right? I mean, just drawing on your own, customer, experience, expertise, and knowing that, there's all different sorts of customers. Staff are a type of customer, right? It's, you want to make sure that they're engaged, and that, because you want them to be productive. You don't want to, you want your retention rates to be high. And yeah, it's just making sure that cooperation is there, and that you're building something that truly works. Because also, it's usually the people on the inside, they're the ones who really know how the organization works. They know the niggles, they know where things are broken, in a way that often, not always, but often, senior management don't.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So I guess following on from that, what's kind of a misconception or a misunderstanding that leaders have when they hear the term organizational design?
Well, I think a lot of them, so the term has often been used simply to refer to restructuring. And so all that crosses many people's minds when they hear that is, oh, so we're going to hire somebody who's basically just going to tell us, which heads to chop and which teams to consolidate. And maybe if we're lucky, we'll get some, role profiles and, some new roles and responsibilities, just our hands and walk off. Whereas what I've learned over the years is that, yes, structure is important, but it's just one aspect of the full design, the full setup of an organization. There's some very hard stuff, like, looking at, systems technology these days, especially AI. There's looking at the processes of an organization, and there's a lot often to be done in terms of tidying those things up, making them more efficient, making them more effective, etc. But then there's often softer, I'm not very fond of that word, but, more human related aspects to organization. Quite frankly, I think more powerful aspects of an organization that need to be looked at, addressed, enhanced. Culture is a huge one. And there's many
Mhm.
aspects, like, what are the mechanisms in place for how people communicate, share information, engage with each other? What are the messages that are being given to to people from management? How are you developing people and making sure that their capabilities are keeping up with the changes and processes and technology? And it's really having a holistic view of everything that impacts the effectiveness of an organization, not just
Yeah.
the structure. Am I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find that fascinating because I think for me, we've all been in organizations where you are led by the organizational chart, and that's kind of how you work. That's how the work flows almost. It's kind of, that team does that, we do this. And in that, there are almost invisible barriers that are put up, these silos, or that's that team over there, they do that. And it's almost like communication is forbidden at that point. It's we can't talk to that team. And I think for me, that's one of the bits of work that I love to do is breaking down those silos and getting people to communicate and showing them just how easy it is. Yes, you have to have the right channels and the right approach to communication, making sure that it's effective and it works for everyone. But I think that could just goes to show how, I don't want to say unimportant an organizational chart is, but it needs to follow the flow of work, right?
It is a flow of work, and it needs to have the people understanding and working within that flow. I've seen, and you and I have talked about this before in the past, Dave, that you know we've gone into organizations where the technology is completely broken and or the processes are completely broken and the organizational chart might just be a photo on the wall or whatever, like nobody pays any attention. But if you've got enough of the right people in place, work still gets done, customers still get served, and you can get outcomes. Whereas the opposite isn't true, that if you've got brilliant streamlined, sexy, sophisticated systems and processes and all the glamorous, marketing and messaging in the world, if people feel, if they're not engaged, if they feel disenfranchised, if they don't have agency, if if they're just coming in and slogging on to get a job done, all of those bells and whistles mean nothing.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the end customers, whoever those end customers are, right? Is it consumers? Is it another business? Are there the businesses? Whatever. They'll get that sense and they'll know that, they'll probably be more likely to move on to a competitor if a competitor can offer the same outcomes at the same price. Whereas, if they can feel that I've got somebody who's looking after my account who cares, that makes such a difference,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a gap between kind of strategic intent of wanting to have the right setup and wanting to achieve greatness, if you like, compared to day-to-day execution? Do you think there's kind of like not a head in the clouds, but kind of, yes, we need to do this, we need to focus on it, but they don't actually take that into daily workings? It's just kind of, we'll get round to that strategic view.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'd be surprised if anyone listening to this, say over the age of 30, but probably even younger, as whatever the working environment has to be, just all these great aspirations. And often, and if you can get the glossy consultants, in and they do the beautiful slide deck and the glossy printed, publication afterwards. It just, sits in a digital or physical shelf and doesn't get looked at. People refer to it from time to time. But I think this is also where consultants often get a bad reputation, is that it's all about the design and it's not about the implementation. Whereas I think this is particularly where Oson and Carter excel, is that we're about that. You were saying this before, rolling up our sleeves, getting involved, working with the people, and actually making the change happen, looking at that strategy document, looking at that vision, looking at whatever it is that senior management have come up with and say, right, what can change from Monday for us to start to move in the right direction, start to achieve the results that we want to achieve. So absolutely, absolutely. There's often such a disconnect. And I get really weary of any strategic conversation that doesn't end with, right, what do we do now? What
Yeah.
changes from today or from next week? And who's owning it, right? Like, and who's going to have that accountability and all, the mechanisms that we put in place to actually make change happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's kind of there's a cost of not, a cost of inaction. And it's, people sit there and go, we need to do that. And like you say, it needs to happen now. It needs to be actionable. It needs to be taken from that meeting into real life. What do you think the cost of ignoring design is during any kind of transformation, both operationally and culturally?
Oh, goodness. Not an easy answer to that simply because, it depends on what the problem at hand is, I would say. Generally speaking, though, I imagine most organizations, I'm struggling to think of those who wouldn't be having this problem of dealing with a marketplace, dealing with a business environment that isn't evolving very quickly, where consumer behaviors are changing quite quickly, where staff behaviors, expectations, attitudes are behaving quickly. And an organization that just kind of digs its heels in and say, this is what's worked for us for the past 30 years. Why do we need to change? Why do we need to, you know, act? And I think what that inaction will inevitably lead to, that cost is at some point, customers, be they end users, be they, internal staff, be they, suppliers, whatever, right? Over time, people will become disengaged because if you're not doing business with them, if you're not, if your transactions with them, even in the public, sector, if they're not efficient, if they're not effective, people are going to stop engaging. And when it says, and it will eventually mean more headache, more cost, more, yeah, just the time and the money, the energy that gets lost, basically dealing with problems that could have been nipped in the bud much earlier. I think you run the risk of that cost. And sometimes better late than never. As I'm making this statement and the word public sector crossed my mind, I was thinking of HMRC here in the UK, but also, how tax is managed, very digitally in Estonia, for instance. And Estonia were, very well ahead of the curve. And, I think the first government basically that allowed all personal income tax to be done via a very straightforward website. And I remember working with government digital services when it was just an idea, gosh, some 20 years ago or something like that. And how I think at that time, HMRC was recognizing that, we need to start doing something differently because even though people are obliged to pay tax, you still have to make it easier. You still have to make it accessible. You have got to make it understandable, etc. Because the more people just file and pay their taxes on time, it's less. You don't have to necessarily like have as many people on staff troubleshooting, or you're going to have as many backlogs, and you're just providing a fundamentally better, more efficient service that that the government will be proud of. I do wonder if anybody at HMRC is hearing those words and thinking, I wonder. But hey, let's have that conversation, because to be fair, my information is 20 years old. But nonetheless, just how any organization can easily lose out if they're just not anticipating and acting on change, right? The change, there are changes in their environment, the changes in their markets, the changes in their in their environments. Yeah, a very long answer to your question there, Dave. But
No, it's a good answer as well. And I think to kind of summarize and play that back, it's if you don't deal with it now, the cost compounds over time, doesn't it? Or if you start to make change and then it doesn't work out, you're building inefficiencies on top of inefficiencies. You're building in change fatigue. People see things happen and change. You go, well, that never came to fruition. So the next time an initiative comes up, people are skeptical straight away from the beginning because they go, "Oh, here we go, isn't another change we've got to get on board with." But they don't buy into it because they've seen stuff fail before. So I think that does compound over time. And to your point about HMRC as an example, I think the phrase I hear all the time is we've always done it this way. And as technology changes and improves at such a vast rate, I think you have to keep up with the times. And that's not kind of just to jump on the bandwagon of AI to say we use AI. You need to have a great and viable case study for it to sort of say this is what it's going to be used for. But in the case of HMRC and tax returns, you've got making tax digital, which seems to be coming closer and closer and closer. But at the same time, there's roadblocks, there's obstacles, because there's technology ultimately getting in the way, I believe, of making it simple and easy for people to use. People's lives are in the palm of their hands now with phones, with technology, what you can do and achieve. And they want that simplicity wherever they go. And I think in the world of customer experience that I live in, that's what people want. They want a transferable, seamless transaction wherever they go. If there's any kind of friction or barrier, that's where it starts to become painful and people go, do you know what? I'll put that off because that's eating too much of my time. I've got a simple task that I can do right here that I'll prioritize. And that's, again, where organizations beyond HMRC have got to start to up their game and go, how do we make sure that we're putting the customer first and making sure that their needs are taken care of? Very, very simply. I see so many chatbots online on websites now that tell you you're talking to a chatbot, which is great. But at the same time, you know the answers are limited unless they've got a great knowledge base behind them. You're sitting there as a consumer going, can I just speak to a human, please? Because you're not giving me the answers I need. And that's the frustration, I think, for a lot of users, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And a good, for me, good chatbot design allows that exit to speak to a human. And there are some things that we don't want to speak to a human about, right? Like if we just need, a simple balance or, a transfer of whatever, right? There's often these simple transactions where we're really happy to just go in and out of a system, or if it's just outlining information to a chatbot, it sorts it all out. You can see that your account details are updated, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Fine, grand. But there are the complex situations. It would be very, it would be very foolhardy, I think, of an organization to just think, oh, we don't need any or very many, customer support staff at all, because the AI will sort it out. And as brilliant
Yeah.
as it is, having something that is, having this very logical entity, interacting with very irrational, often are very rational human beings, doesn't always generate positive outcomes for both parties. Because a poor person who can't get the problem, they're starting to just waste all of the, then they are going to try to phone every number they can phone about the organization, trying to speak to the relevant, human being. And if just, that infrastructure had been set up to handle the, if we look at the 80-20 rules, if you can, okay, so have the chatbot deal with the 80%, that stuff that's really straightforward, doesn't require a huge amount of sophistication or empathy for that matter, right? Because often people, when they're getting in touch, they're feeling really, really emotional. Make sure you've got something for that 20% of the person who's got the very unusual situation, or who's feeling just so emotional that they start, quite frankly, wasting the time of the organization when that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really key is knowing what it's going to be used for. And I think if you sort of tar it with the brush of we can use it for everything, that's great. The key word you've used there is empathy. I think in a lot of chatbots and AI, the word I heard recently was AI can act as a human. And I think that's the key word. It's an act. It's not real life. It's acting like a human. And the empathy and the emotion that it might be portraying isn't real. They are essentially words on a screen or being dictated to you. I think when you're speaking to a human and you are looking at the whites of their eyes, potentially, if it's face to face, if it's over the phone, you can hear that person's engagement for one, but two, you can hear if they care. And I think when there's more delicate matters, it's understanding which path that customer needs to go down. And I think this is where we align quite well. You've got the organizational design, but you've kind of got the customer flow and that customer journey of where does the customer go? How do they get through to the right departments, the right teams? At what point do they interact with certain parts of the organization? And how does that flow inside the organization after? So I think this kind of leads me to my next question is you can do what you do in isolation, right? You can look at organizational design and structure. If there is a task, if there's a project that needs to be addressed or completed. But what do you think changes when leaders finally look at the entire thing, like people, process, customer, structure together rather than in isolation?
A couple of things. I think a couple of things can happen. I think at first, and there's there's a very traditional change curve where you often there's a period of great enthusiasm followed by a great, I think we used to call it in different firms that I've worked for, the valley of despair, where the reality of just the sheer volume of things that could be looked at starts to hit, and it feels really, really overwhelming. Oh my God, we've got to look at our processes, and we've got to look at our culture, and we've got to look at our systems, and oh, do we have the right people in the right jobs? And, do we need to start recruiting people in? And it can all feel incredibly overwhelming. But one starts to come out of that. And I think at least once all of that does sink in and the initial shock passes, then there can be an opportunity for, and especially from conversations, I can't emphasize this enough, that I think the work I do, the work we do, Dave, is just, it's all about people at the end. It's all about people having conversations and, fleshing, sharing their thoughts and emotions to go through this, through those sorts of conversations, it starts to become clear, like really where, you know, you're not going to fix everything all at once, but you start to get clarity as to what exactly is the thing that you need to be fixing. And what I have noticed for myself in the past, and I started off, as I think I mentioned, in IT consulting of all places, and often projects start with technology, which in my model is actually one of the last things you look at. But technology, you can see it. You can see that, oh, it's clunky, it's not working, and that we're not getting the right data, and it's really hard to use, and the performance isn't good. Blah 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 blah. So for whatever tech reason, somebody comes in and they start looking at that, then from these conversations, and when you start to see how interlinked everything is, you can go back and realize, well, you know what, maybe, don't get me, like maybe the systems aren't great, but what would have an even bigger impact is if we looked at training, or if we looked at recruitment, or if we actually looked at the overall organizational setup, and maybe look at ask the question, do we have the right people in the right roles, or look at some of the cultural aspects of working, and is there anything we can be doing to help people cope with our creaking systems, but still to build a better foundation for our organization, so that when we do look at the systems, it'll be even more powerful than if we had just tried to fix the system, but we still have people who don't really know how to use them or make the most out of them, etc. Yeah, it comes back to that change curve. It comes back to that the perspective of actually what is the thing that we need to be fixed. And 9 times out of 10, it's not the thing that you originally asked the consultant to come in and look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. I think that's really key is I think sometimes leaders have it in their head, they know what needs to change, don't they? And they take that approach of, we'll bring someone in to do that. It could be you want to build better relationships with your customers. Brilliant, fantastic. Go in, sit in front of them. Tell me about the business. How do you work? Have you got a vision in place? Have you got values in place? No. Okay, so you need to set the direction of travel. Everyone needs to be on the same page before we start to try and make change happen, because you want to be pulling in the right direction, knowing, okay, this is the journey we're on. And ideally, everyone needs to create that together rather than it coming from the top down. How do we involve people from the very beginning to say, we want you to help us shape the future? And then they're buying into that because they're helping to create it. So I think you're spot on there. I think that that initial change or improvement that leaders want to make, there's something previous or prior to that that needs to be done or be addressed first. Coming from the US, Javier, what differences do you notice in how UK or European organizations approach the term change?
That's a really good question. I can't lie. That's not one that I've actually thought about before. One thing I do know is that, and this was several years ago, and so maybe things have changed. And I should also caveat this by saying I haven't lived in the States in ages. But a few years back, the consultancy that I was working with, we typed organizational change into Google with an S, right? So the British spelling. And what came up was the stuff that you and I have been talking about, right? Like the organizational effectiveness, organizational structures, like how to enable those structures to work, in practice, capability, recruitment, blah, 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 that sort of stuff. In the States, if you do it with Z and it's organizational change, you get things like wardrobe organizers. And it's about home accessories or shelves for offices, or I don't know, I just found that really, really funny. And I think that, so if we could extrapolate from that, so I appreciate it's an imperfect data source, but nonetheless, that I think that this side of the pond, people look at organizations in a more holistic way than they generally do in the States. I think in the States, often, organizational change is seen as more mechanical, structural. It is more about, inputs, outputs, and it's not necessarily, or is less often, less people centric than it is here. So I have found, for myself, working, with you, with other consultancies, that, our messages seem to be more readily listened to, I think, here than they are in the States. But, I am fairly certain that, in the US, there are probably vast exceptions to that. And over recent years, I imagine some of that has been changing. But yeah, that would be, I'm struggling with the answer to this one. I can't lie, but I think that probably is what the distinction would be, and would welcome comments to anybody listening to
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
those in the U.S. and especially those in the U.S. working in organizational change with a Z. What your view on the question would be?
Yeah. That's fascinating. That's a great insight. So I've personally learned a lot in this conversation. I know we've worked and spoken for hours before, but I'm still learning, which is great. Hopefully this has resonated with a lot of people that have been listening or watching. Javier, if you could give a bit of advice for people listening that might be going through this or beginning to explore it, what's one early sign, a warning sign that an organization's design is no longer fit for purpose?
If how's this a really casual, easy way is if you're finding yourself, coming home at the end of the evening and you're moaning about the same problem, right? Like, oh, I'm really struggling working with this team, or oh, why is everyone always off sick, or why why is it taking so long to get XYZ done, or oh, why are we losing so much customers? If you've got that sort of same moan when you're sitting with your friends or your partner or whomever at the end of the evening, pause and take a step back and think, you know what? Maybe there's something systematic here. It's not unlike, it's not like having a, I don't know, some sort of like soreness or a cough or something appearing in your own body, right? One cough, you probably don't think anything of it. You move on and you go on your day. Been a couple of days, you've got that cough or you've got that, that twitchy elbow or whatever it happens to be. That's probably when you should say, I wonder if there's something going on here. Let me speak to a professional who can help me sort of like, you know, diagnose what's going on here and figure out what's going on. Same for companies. I mean, yeah, same for companies.
That's brilliant. I love that. So, if leaders remember one thing about organizational design from this conversation, what should it be?
That organizational design is not just about or is not organizational structure. It really is about all aspects of the organization from everything from your people and culture through to how you train them, the processes, technology, etc. And knowing that it is all interlinked, none of that exists in isolation.
Fantastic. If you up for it, Javier, I've got 3 rapid fire questions for you to finish off on.
Never any good at these, but go for it. Go for it.
Okay. One habit that you won't compromise on.
Daily meditation.
Oh, I love that. Brilliant. One mistake that's taught you the most.
I moved to the US in 2016 to be closer to my parents, completely upended my life in the UK, ended up coming back a year and a half later. What I realized I could have, should have done is actually just got on a plane and just visited them more often. There are often simple, straightforward solutions right in our face, and we can over-engineer and yeah, we can over-engineer solutions that overcomplicate things with subpar results.
Brilliant. And finally, one thing leaders don't talk about enough.
Emotions. Organizations are made up of people. People are irrational, emotional creatures. If you deny that that is what is going on, you failed before you started.
Amazing. Javier, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Dave.
That's it for this episode of Stubby Talks Transformation. Real leaders, real change. Follow the show for the next conversation, and we'll see you next time.